Gebetsbuch aus Neuendetellsau.
Oh ja. Ja, schön. Raimund Verlag.
Ich möchte nachher mit dir sprechen ein
Ja.
bisschen.
Ja, ja.
Wenn du eine Minute Zeit
Oh,
hast.
ich habe Zeit.
Ja.
Ich habe Zeit bis zum Abend. Soll ich ein Gebet daraus sprechen? Später irgendwann?
Jawohl.
Ich schau mal. Georg Fitzidum. Den habe ich persönlich gekannt.
Kommt aus Südafrika.
Oh. Auch Deutsch?
Ja, jawohl. Der Pfarrer hat meine Mutter beerdigt. Die sprach gutes Deutsch.
In Südafrika?
Ja.
Da ist deine Mutter gestorben?
Ja, vor 2 Jahren.
Oh. Schau ich mal, ob ich hier was Passendes finde. Gell? Danke.
Wait for Dan to get back. He's eating dessert. He's getting dessert. And Dan, oh, much better. He was going to introduce them. He was going to introduce him. Yeah. Dan Hubenstricker. He's back there. I'll start it off then. Okay. We're going to get going. Okay. Let's get started. I, so, this is part of our 175th anniversary. I have a bad voice. Anybody on the committee, please stand up for the 175th. Roy, I think Melissa, Tom. Thanks. Will be in June 25th will be the ceremony. But I have Dan Hubenstricker here from Frankenmuth to introduce our speaker.
Thank you. I've been hosting Gunter at my house, and we have kept him busy with different speaking engagements. He's a retired English teacher, and his special gift is that he can tell us about our roots in Neuendetellsau and what life was like for our pioneer ancestors who Pastor Leah there organized to found our settlements. And it's very rare that you find a person who knows the German history and can tell us in English how, the way it was back then. So it's a delight to have him. He flew himself. Is this better? Good.
Just make sure that it's not going to quit on you.
So let's give Gunter Kolhmann from Neuendetellsau a warm welcome.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the very warm welcome. Thank you, Daniel, for the friendly introduction. And on this wonderful Sunday, I'm very happy to be here and to be here in all those four former colonies that have to do with Neuendetellsau. I've already given some presentations up to now, and I used my manuscripts, but I think I'll just talk now, just as it is in my head, because if I use the manuscripts, this will possibly hinder me from presenting you my ideas and the essentials of the whole interesting story. There are phases in life I've experienced that several times in my long life when you learn more in a few days than in years. This is the case now that I'm here in America, here in this part for the first time. I've been to the West several times, but not here. So I learned so much, and I think it's not good or not worthwhile keeping it for myself, but trying to transmit this to you, what I learned and what I found out. Of course, I studied much of it in the books. I had so much to do before I traveled, before I went aboard the plane. I wanted to visit some people still, but I had no time because I had to study so much to all the facts and so on. But here now I am, and I can see with my own eyes what this story is about. Wilhelm Löh, this is the name I asked some people when I'm here. I met someone and then I asked them, do you speak German? And the next question was, have you heard about Wilhelm Löh, in American William Löh? And some of them know, yes, and you have them in the church in Frankenmuth. But for Wilhelm Löh, I must say, all this would possibly not exist. At least not in this way as it exists. The more I study this story, the more I admire this man. He was a pastor in Neuendetellsau from 1837 to 1872. Before he was in Bertholdsdorf, a still smaller village, as a vicar for some time, and when he came to Neuendetellsau, because they had invited him, they had no pastor. When he saw the village for the first time, he said, in English now I said, I don't want to be dead in this village. I don't want to be buried here. The village was so miserable, so poor, so Löh was really aghast. He didn't want to stay. And then he stayed for 37 years. This is a miracle. Mysterious ways of God. And what he did for Neuendetellsau, you can see now, Neuendetellsau now is famous all over the world, the same as Frankenmuth, although the reasons are different. But Löh really did something for Neuendetellsau and for the people. Well, as I said, he came in 1937. That was about a few years before the first colonists or settlers or whatever you might call them, or missionaries, before they boarded a ship in Bremerhaven and sailed to America. The more I study this story, I must say, the more I'm amazed by their courage, these people. I was twice in Frankenmuth at the place where it all started, the blockhouse and the bells, church bells in the forest. You can see there. My God, when I look in the window of the blockhouse, imagining the people all lived there, spent a whole winter there, all of them. Those terrible winters I can imagine that were in those times, with no roads, nothing paved. What courage did they have? That's, I think, why This place is rightly called Frankenmut, the courage of the Franconians. And the name dates from Lø, who said, we'll call it Frankenmut. How did it all come about that they sailed at all and came here? There was a letter, an urgent letter from a certain pastor named Winniken, who was here as a circuit rider. I learned that word here today, you know. I didn't know all these words before. I taught English for more than 30 years, but I didn't know all the vocabulary then. So I learned a lot of new vocabularies as well. These circuit riders, there were just a few of them, and they were in need. They couldn't do all the work that was to do. Immigrants had come before the first here came to Frankenmut, and they were really in need, because in those times people, I just quote one example of what they were afraid of. They were afraid to die, to enter the other world, to be in front of their Creator without having heard the word of God, without salvation. This must have been a terrible fear. So this man, Winniken, he wrote a letter which, by the way, reached Wilhelm Lø in Neuendetellsau. The letter is about this. I just give the essentials. Come here and help us. We're in terrible need. Is this your love for Jesus that you just let this go on? You must help us. Come over. So what did Lø do? He organized some young men, not pastors, by the way, but artisans, simple young men, and taught them, trained them. You know, there were Christians. They knew a lot about the Bible and so on in those times. They went to church, but they were not trained in things that were necessary here. The sacraments, for example. Baptizing the newborn, blessing the loving couples, and providing a decent funeral for those who had passed to the other world. So Lø trained them. The first two were a certain Ernst and Adam and Bürger, and they lived, this is a strange coincidence of history, they lived in a house, in a farmhouse, opposite the farmhouse where I was born and raised. There lived an elderly lady, Sophie Quent, and I visited her very often, and she gave me her photo albums and said, Gunter, you can take my photo album and scan the pictures and so on. So it's a real coincidence. I was raised there. And another coincidence, in my house where I was born, that was number 66. In those times, the streets didn't have names, just the houses had numbers. In house number 66, there lived a poor boy born blind, der blinde Johann, blind John. And Lee taught him Braille so he could read the Bible. And he was such an expert in the Bible, you can read them in the books, you can read it on the internet, that Lee asked him when he had a question about the Bible. This blind John was born, of course, more than 100 years before me, in the same house. So there are many coincidences now. It's another coincidence that just the settlers left on the 20th of April in 1847. Another coincidence is I told a long story about my experience when the Americans came to Neuendetellsau at the end of World War II, that they came to Neuendetellsau on the 21st of April. I remember that when I was barely 5 years old. In June I turned 5, and in April the Americans came and ended this nightmare of my early boyhood. Yeah? So there are so many coincidences. Well, Lø was able to convince some people to really dare this adventure. They went first to Bremerhaven, which was painful enough in those times. Traveling was not easy, and then aboard a ship. What were the reasons? One, as I said, helping those who were already there with their belief. Louis had another thing in mind. They ought to show the original inhabitants here how beautiful life is with Jesus. Was his other idea. And there was one reason, which you also can find in the records and in the books, but some people don't know that. There were many young people in Franconia, then, which belonged to the Kingdom of Bavaria. Germany did not yet exist as a state. It was the Kingdom of Bavaria. And the King of Bavaria had restrictive laws for settling and marrying and settling in Bavaria. If you had no money, if you were poor, if you didn't have the means to have a family, you were not allowed to marry. They thought by this way they might prevent offspring that would be a burden to the community. Rubbish. Offspring they did have, of course, sometimes up to 4 or 5 kids. The poor farm hands, male and female, and they lived together as Leu he expressed it, in sin and shame. Yeah. So he knew if they leave the state of Bavaria, then they can marry. The same moment they were among the first group, 5 couples were married by Pastor Kramer on a sandbank, by the way, because the pilot of the ship, he had drunk, and they went on a sandbank, had to spend one day there. The captain was an experienced man, so I read, and within that time, when they were on the sandbank on the river Elbe, which is tributary to the North Sea, he married these couples. The same moment they had left German soil, they could be happy and live together. So this was another important reason, and many followed. You can imagine that there was word among those who had already emigrated, come to America here, you can have a free life. Land was cheap. I can't go into too many details now. I studied this now when I was here, what land cost, and I saw it with my own eyes, what that means, land. When I came with Daniel on Sunday, the most frequent adjective I used, vast. Vast, it's also vast here. You can't imagine. Come to Neuendetellsau, come to Franconia, come to the small towns in wine Franconia where wine is grown. Come to the small medieval towns which are surrounded by a wall, and you have 2 gates, one on the south side, another one on the north side. When you want to enter the town, you have to wait until the other car comes out. It's also narrow and poor. And here, vast. There's so much space. It's unimaginable for me. So, another thing was the poverty. Pauperism is a key word that we have to use here, pauperism. People were so poor, you can't call them farmers, they weren't farmers. I would use the word crofters, but I think that's a Scottish word. Yeah. My accent, somebody said, is British. That's from our education in Germany. Yes, and when I taught English, of course, in Germany, we had to use the British English. It's funny, when I was in America in London with a friend in 1958, we were 18 years old, to see all those things from the English books like Tower Bridge and St. Paul's Church, and we traveled there hitchhiking. We had no money. And we went to St. Paul's to a service. It's very funny because when we sang all the hymns with them, and when it was over, 2 elderly ladies were there, and one of them said, "Are you young men from America?" Because you have such an American accent. That's funny. Another story which I can add here is easier to do this without my manuscript, you see, because I then can tell the stories as they come to my head. After I was 5, suddenly that German culture, which was not worth anything, as you know, I must really put it like this, had disappeared, and we were raised by the American culture. The first American music I heard, I remember it. Don't need any words, just the music. I was electrified, and I still am as an old man today when I hear those first sounds. Oh, this was a thing that went through and through. That's his voice. Here they came with Glenn Miller in the mood. Later in 1956, I bought a guitar from my own money that I had served in vacation. I bought a guitar, not this one. This belongs to a lady from here. And in 1956, then our ideal was a man with a guitar standing there and singing, yeah? Well, I saw him about walking with another man today. See you later, alligator. Rock around the clock, and so on. Those were the songs we sang when we were 16, 17, 18. So I want to say my whole education after 1945 was American. Fortunately, yeah. My wife, who is from Eastern Germany, we got to know each other in 1957. She grew up in Eastern Germany. She left that part of Germany the day after her 16th birthday, alone, without her family, because she wanted to live in the West. She was filled up with that system. I must laugh whenever she shows me what they had to do as school children. She can do it so well. I can't do it so well. In the morning, children all on the schoolyard, and strangely putting their fingers on their hand on the head. And the teacher said, "Junge Pioniere, seid bereit." And the children, "Immer bereit, immer bereit." Young pioneers, be ready. The young ones, always ready, always ready. This is only one example of how the children were educated, you know. If we are here in a church, so to say, you can imagine what that was, the communist system for the church, for the believers. It was very difficult. My wife said Ernie is her name, not like that from the Muppet Show, but without an E at the end. And she said when she was 14, they had to make a decision between the Jugendweihe, which was a communist thing, or confirmation. She chose confirmation, and many of our friends too. But many, of course, chose Jugendweihe. They were given presents in order to do that kind of thing. These are only some examples. I want to say that they grew up really differently because that part of Germany was occupied by the Soviets. I think it's better to avoid the word Russians, say Soviets, because otherwise you would get the impression that the Russians are the same people as we are. And of course, it's the same with the war of Ukraine nowadays. It's either the system or it's one man, but it's not the people. The people everywhere, I think, are more inclined to have peace. I grew up in Germany, as I said, in 1945. Let's go back to Leo's story. Many people from Neuendetellsau and other, when I see, when I ask them where are your ancestors from, they say, for example, Neuendetellsau or Gunzenhausen, near Gunzenhausen, and other places, Rostal, all places I know. And it was the same thing everywhere. pauperism, poverty. And when they come here, they could have a decent living. Well, I think it's good if I illustrate this with my photos. I took a lot of photos because I work in the Heimat- und Geschichtsverein in Neuendetellsau. This is a club. We care the culture and the history of the town. And I have so many photos, I could show photos until tonight. Yeah. Today I'll start with those ones I haven't shown yet. At the other presentations, I'll start with the photos that have to do with America, with the immigration of the 19th century, 178 years ago, exactly to these days. I'll start the computer. Wait a minute. This is my friend in Barcelona. And his daughter. That's good to start with Neuendetellsau, a good impression of what it looked like around William Lewis' time. This is the place where the mission started. Löhe had a good friend named Friedrich Bauer, who was born in 1812. Löhe was born in 1808. So Bauer was 4 years younger, and he came from Nuremberg. And Löhe asked him to help him in the business of the mission thing. Mission thing. Why mission thing? I must mention this also. Despisingly, those superiors from the church, for example, in Munich, Bavaria was Catholic, you see, they called it this mission thing. It's better, they said, it's more important, or like something like that, to invest money into the fatherland than the Kafirs in Africa or the savages in North America. So Löhe had to really to be a rebel to start this. If he hadn't been a rebel, if he had been like other pastors, let's say, there were some of course before him, who just did their job, and if Löhe had been one of them, he would have said, "Oh, what am I interested in that America? Leave me alone with this. I'm doing my business here." Luckily, in history, there was grace from above, I believe, that gave Neuendetellsau and this part of America such a man who really cared. And so they had a lot of resistance to start this mission thing. It started here when Friedrich Bauer, as I said, 4 years younger than Löhe, bought this Wirtshaus, you call it a Wirtshaus, a beer house, an inn, a restaurant is too much, simply a Wirtshaus where the young men drank. And he gave the first missionaries food and lodging. And there were in Neuendetellsau 4 such ponds where there were geese and ducks and so on. It was also dirty, and same motive. I think I can do it quickly, not to lose too much time. This is a model in the Löhe Museum. When you ever come to Neuendetellsau, visit the Löhe Museum, the museum of the time of Löhe. Here you can study all these things. This is a model that was used on the 700 years of Neuendetellsau. The new mission, built by Friedrich Bauer, a big house. Today it's on the same place. There is the mission house still. That's what it looked like when I was a boy, the mission. There were many, many young men from all over Germany who studied here. And of course, the time of going to America was long over then. In the 1890s, missions were founded in Australia, in New Guinea, in Africa, some, and then hundreds and hundreds of young men were trained to go to these parts of the world as missionaries. I knew many of them, of course, when I was a kid. Das Auswandererschiff Caroline. The ship, the first settlers here came in 1845, you see. On this nutshell, they came unimaginably. They had 7 storms. They couldn't use the English Channel. I don't know why. They had to sail around Scotland in the north. You can imagine the storms there were much more heavier than in the south. They had 7 storms, one for 3 days. During a storm, they had to be down in the ship. They couldn't go on deck. Otherwise, they would have been swept overboard. They couldn't even really stand upright there. The food was bad, full of worms and moist and spoiled. The water perhaps not safe. Not all did arrive in later years. Because these, after them, many more came, always in the same way. I can imagine how he can stand this for 50 days. 1 month and 20 days. Not knowing where you are going, being sure that you can never return, saying goodbye to your neighbors, perhaps to your loved ones. It's not like with me today. When my job is done here, I board a plane in Detroit and then Chicago and off to Frankfurt, I'm home again. No, if they went, it was for good for the whole life. This is what the ship was like, how they lived. The ships were usually meant for goods and not for people. This is one of the trunks they used of wood. Neuendetellsau, Zoll, Nuremberg, Bayern, Bavaria, Germany. This is Friedrich Bauer, Louis' friend. He had a son, Frederick, also called Friedrich, who then in America called himself Frederick, and he went to this region here. And he had a son called Wilson, and Wilson had a son called James. James, now 90, in January he turned 90, a good friend of mine. He visited Neuendetellsau at the 200th birthday of his great-great-grandfather. Lives in Battle Creek. Neuendetellsau, I sometimes use this photo when I want to show the character of Neuendetellsau. And I forgot to say in the church, I shall bring you the greetings of the 2 parishes. We have 2 parishes, namely St. Nikolai, which was Louis' parish in the beginning. The church called St. Nikolai, after St. Nicholas. And the other one is St. Lawrence, like here. But this here, it looks like a cathedral. There's one point in Neuendetellsau, in a field, and a little higher up. And you have to know this point. I go to this point very often on my bike and take pictures. It depends on the weather, how good the pictures are. There's one point where the 2 churches are together, like a cathedral. If you move a little to the side, then the towers are offer another picture like this. So here you have, I call it, jokingly, I call it Saint Nicolaurentius. Saint Nicolaurentius, the 2 churches. Neuendetellsau. Well, the village in Louis' time. Again, pictures that give an impression of the character of the people of the village. Poor, poor, poor. The house is damp, people lived together with the cattle. Here there was space for the cattle near the house. They lived in the same building. The walls were damp. Løe called the houses knallhytten, the knallhytten, which means bang huts, jokingly, because there was a danger that they went up in flames. In former times, you know, people had no electric light. Then everywhere at night or in the evening when they had to go to look after the cattle or so and had to do something, they had to use a lantern, they had to use open light, so there was always a danger of fire. And when a fire broke out and the roofs were of straw-thatched houses, then the house was gone. There was a night a vigilant, or what do you call it, an officer of the village, to go round at night to look if everything was in order. My great-grandfather was such a man. This is a house in Mausendorf, which I often take photos of, Mausendorf. That's where the ancestors of the Zender family come from, a part of Neuendetellsau. Again, you can see the character of those houses, people and cattle in one house. This is possible for the potatoes. This house still stands as it is presented here. Many of them, of course, are torn down, and you know where to find them. You know where to find those houses. This is the same house. The cattle here, the animals, and the people here. This is the barn, so to say. What in Frankenmuth, I heard that and was amused by it. What you call the Scheiern. Well, they had the Scheiern in the house. They didn't have any money to build a real Scheune, a barn. It was in the house. Upstairs, common chambers, rooms for the farm hands, female and male. Only one room could be heated, namely the kitchen, and beside what we call the Stumm, the living room, which you can't really call a living room, it was so small, and upstairs those rooms couldn't be heated, they were cold. And the rooms for the female farm hands, by the way, had by law, it had to be possible that they were locked by law. Yeah. This is my neighbor's house, a manure pile. I got it now. This word, a manure pile in front of the house. The bigger the manure pile, the more respected the farmer. Again, here for the cattle, and here you see a well. They had their own water, of course. The well still, the pump by hand. The most common drink, the safest drink was beer and wine. Water was not so safe. That's of course why the people drank a lot of beer, which Løe didn't like at all. He liked the dialect. He spoke dialect, Franconian, Dettelshauer dialect on the pulpit, as I read, but he didn't like the feast, the Karva, the Kirchweih. He didn't like the young men to drink a lot of beer. He didn't like Rockenstube. Those were places where young people met in the evening with spinning wheels and making textiles and so on. Mainly the girls, of course, and you can imagine that the boys, that they knew this, and the boys went there, and these were the places where things happened that Løe didn't like at all. So he didn't like that people drank too much beer. This is my birthplace. My great-grandmother, Shirley Løe, baptized her. She was born in 1951. If we think of Løe, yeah. 18, yeah, sorry. She was born in 1851, so when Løe arrived in 1937, he was already there for some years, surely baptized her up and even confirmed her. My grandmother, it's her daughter, my grandfather, who came from another village and married my grandmother and two of their children. My mother was not yet born, she was born in 1917, so this must be around 1912. My great-grandmother, she died from the Spanish flu in 1917. Millions of people in Europe died from that flu. This is the chamber upstairs of my parents that my grandfather gave to my mom when she was 23. And I got to know my father, so they could live in here. And this is where I was born. Not in a hospital, by the way. I was born really in Neuendetellsau, in this house. An enlargement, see my grandmother. The grandfather is not in the photo. The Nachtwächter, the night vigilant. My grandmother said, there came a photographer. People did not have a camera then. It came men and asked people, come out, I take a photo of you and your house and so on. My grandmother said, der Vater hat nicht ausgewollt. Der Vater hat auch drauf gesagt, er hat nicht ausgewollt. Which means her husband, the father, he didn't want, her father, he didn't want to go out. He didn't want to be dead. I haven't got one single photo of him. He died in 1917, a few months before my mother was born. My grandfather, in the silhouette of Neuendetellsau, here you see St. Nikolai, and the village, of course, then was still very intact, just a small village with no settlements around, and he had some fields, and he plowed here with one cow. The cow pulled the plow. He grew everything, potatoes, wheat, and the other one that was called rye for the black bread, the really good black bread, which I must say I miss a little here, that good black German bread. And grandmother baked 4 loaves of that black bread every week. And the whole house, the whole family, there were 19 in all, with their children and grandchildren. They all lived off this wonderful bread. Everybody could take what he wanted. The potatoes were down in the basement. Everybody could take what he wanted. It was a big family, and they didn't sell anything, just he worked from morning till night, and grandma too, and my mother helped, and the brothers helped, as long as they were not off in Russia or somewhere at war. So this was an agriculture just for themselves, growing everything, not specializing. Later people specialized, and then of course they became more well-to-do. They kept pigs, a few cows, hens, ducks, a dog of course, and a cat. My mother, can imagine. I mean, this is not exactly the time of Lö, but things didn't change. They hadn't changed very much, you know. In former times, the world didn't change as fast as it is changing now. Take a man who would be off, let's say, for 20 years or 30 years, maybe in prison or somewhere, and comes back, let's say, around 1910, nothing would have changed much. But nowadays, if you stay away for 10 years or 20 years, you won't recognize the world. Not in 5 years. It's changing so fast. So this is what people might have looked like in Lö's time. I always look at the shoes. This is very interesting for me, the shoes. They couldn't buy any shoes. They had to use the shoes of the older sister or brother. And the shoes had to be solid because the streets were not paved. They walked through mud and dirt. The youngest brother of my mother, Uncle Schorsch, it's funny with the names also. For the boys, they had you can say a little bit in joke, 3 names. The Hans, Hansler, the Gerch, the Georg, Skerkler, and Smichel, always with a la at the end, as long as they were children. The diminutive in Franconian is la. It's Hansla, it's Michel, and it's Skerkler. And when they were through with these 3 names, they started anew with the same, because that's why I have 2 uncles called Gerch. This one then was called Schoschler. It's a Schoschler. George from French, Georges. You see, my brother's cousin, and my Aunt Anne. My Aunt Anne was born in 1914 and died a few days before her 100th birthday in 2014. Oh, I loved her so much. She told me so many stories. And she married into another village and, sorry to say, had no children. My Tante Anna. This was Neuendetellsau was like at Louis' time. See, the village, the place where I was born here, the last house to the west. This street was not important at all. It was just a path because further here to the west, the station was built in 1899, around the turn of the century. A station was built. Also, train station. Also, we can be attributed to Louis because Louis, I'll come to that in a minute, founded the Diakonissenanstalt, the Anstalt, the Deaconess Institute, and then Neuendetellsau grew and grew and grew and got more and more important with hospitals and homes for the elderly and homes for handicapped people and so on, and so they needed a railway station. It was lucky because Neuendetellsau was not on the line that went from Nuremberg to Stuttgart. It was quite a few kilometers away from that. But thanks to Louis, we got a railway station here. And as I say, this was a village, nothing was important here. When the first an innkeeper here built his inn near the station, people said, "Are you crazy here? There's nothing here, just fields." And he said, I put it in German, "Jeden Tag kommt ein Dummer und trinkt ein Bier bei mir." Every day a stupid one comes and drinks a beer. A stupid one comes by train and drinks a beer. This is what people tell that he said. Nowadays, all this, of course, is there's a carpenter later and masons business and so on, because in Louis' time business boomed. All the houses to be built and so on. You see, the street went straight through the village. That's the church and the castle here. And Louis built his institute, Deaconess Institute, to the west here. So for several years there were two Neuendetellsau, the village and the institute. Nowadays, of course, it's all one, and it offers 6,000 jobs for people. Especially, of course, I come to that before I forget, or I think I'll talk about it before I forget, especially, of course, for women. That was another brilliant idea of Louis, which I just can admire in those times. You know what women were worth in those times? Can you imagine? There's a saying, a Franconian saying, perhaps some of the elderly people still know it or have heard about it. Gaulsterm is Kofferterm. Oh, Moment. Weibersterm ist Kofferterm. Aber Gaulverrecken, this is erschrecken. Which means when a woman dies, that's not a catastrophe, a disaster. But when a horse dies, this is terror. Oh. Yeah, it sounds horrible. Weibersterm ist Kofferterm, aber Gaulverrecken, das ist erschrecken. Many women, of course, died in childbirth. Hygiene was very bad. If a woman had, let's say, 7, 8, 9 children, there was a great chance that someday she would die in childbed. So what happened? The man, he took another wife, mostly younger. I sometimes call it the vertical bigamy, not a horizontal bigamy, vertical bigamy. So they married again. They had to marry again just because of their children. But if a horse died, only 2 or 3 farmers, as I said, is not a correct expression, only 2 or 3 of these people had horses. The others had to use their cows to drive the wagon. So when a horse died, it was really a financial catastrophe. So So poor were those people. So you see, the farms were like this. Here were the farms and the fields. And some farmers who were a little richer, they got a field like this, very long and narrow outside the village, but otherwise there was nothing. Louis wanted the settlers, because he had never been here and seen it with his own eyes. If I hadn't been here now, I think I wouldn't have thought about it. You must see it with your own eyes. Louis had thought that the settlers in America ought to do the same thing, being together in one village. This is not possible, impossible. They resisted. They said, no, we can't do it like that. So here is the fact that you are sometimes miles and miles apart. When we go somewhere to a neighbor, let's say, then it's a minute's drive, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes. When I go to a neighbor, it's just across the street. So this was impossible, the village. They had to settle in another way, which led to some misunderstanding and of course, a little trouble between Louis and the settlers. You see the fields around. All this is now full of houses, settlements, new houses, new, what do you call them, or new quarters or communities. In America, you call them gated communities sometimes. And it's all different now. Women. Let's have a look at women. That's what I wanted to say. In those times, women, if they didn't have enough money, they had great difficulties. Jobs didn't exist for women. There were no factories, no offices, nothing. If a girl, she had the option, either the option to live together with a man. Marriage was impossible because of the laws. If she lived together with a man, of course, natural was that she had a baby or 2 or 3 babies. And then education or training was impossible anyway. She didn't have time. She had the possibility to stay alone as an unmarried girl, or later called an old spinster, with her family in the same house. That was another option. Otherwise, none. Louis thought about it. And as he was really a friend of the female sex, a friend of women in the good sense, the same as he once wrote, he wrote it literally, Ich bin ein Freund der Blöden, which was a normal word then. I'm a friend of the handicapped, of the feeble-minded. So he was a friend of those girls and women who had no opportunity to have a future. And he said, we must do something for these girls and women. So he founded the Deaconess Institute, first in the central in the village, the central Gasthaus zur Sonne, when you come to Neuendetellsau, opposite the church. There you can read, here Louis founded the Deaconess Institute in 1845. That was 9 years before he was very busy with the American emigration. Another thing that I almost must think that it came from above, all these accidents. Sometimes disasters happen. We think it's a disaster, but God's way are mysterious. It may have been good for the whole business, for that thing that developed. Louis married Helene, a girl 9 years younger than he. He had confirmed her when he was a young pastor. And she was so pious, so she was fit for him. They went into the farmhouse, into the pastor's house in Neuendetellsau in the center, and had 4 children. A very happy marriage. Louis once wrote that his mother-in-law scolded him because spending some money I think it was Santa Claus or something like that. Nikolaus, not Christmas, but St. Nikolaus, spending a little money to play with the children. And he wrote, he told his mother-in-law, playing 1 hour with my children is more important than studying 1 hour. He was so happy at that time with those 4 little children, who of course were born after the other. Here you see, sometimes they weren't more than 15 months between one birth and the next. So Löhe was also a very good family father. And then Helene died at the age of 24. 24 years old from a fever. It's so unimaginable to me. After a happy marriage, his mother, of course, urged him, and people from the parish urged him to remarry. A pastor must be married. What's about your kids? You should remarry. He didn't remarry. He stayed alone because he had loved his Helene so much. To his mother, to his mother, his own mother. He wrote, this is a quotation, "Lassen Sie mich desenthalben in Ruhe. Leave me alone with this," quite harshly. And it must be seen in combination with the text he wrote into a diaconis's, what do you call it, Dichterbuch or Stammbuch, as we say, Stammbuch. They had little books where the friends wrote in, "Was will ich? What is it that I want? What's my intention? Dienen will ich. I want to serve. I want to serve." And he goes on. I want to serve. What is my reward? My reward is that I'm allowed to serve. Or you can also translate it by that I'm able to serve. Mein Lohn ist, dass ich dienen darf. I want to serve the Lord, now it goes on, in his poor and miserable, in the poorest and miserable. There are 4 categories of poor and miserable people, if you think about it. The old ones, who are already weak and poor and miserable, we will get more and more of them, surely, in the future, because people live up to 80, 85, 90, 95, 100. In former times, this was not a problem, because when I read the tombstones, the graveyard, of course, 60, 64. Nowadays, we get more and more such people, dementia. So the old ones who are already weak, the young ones, the very young ones, the kids, the toddlers who are still weak, can't take care of themselves, the sick, who are temporarily weak and need a hospital, an operation or so, and then they are well again, and those who are weak forever. People who are born deaf or blind or with physical defects, so they can't walk. You see these people in Neuendetellsau everywhere. The village is full of them still, because all this still exists. And these were Löhe's friends and protégés. A fascinating idea. And his fascinating idea was to combine this with the need of the women who had no chance to make a living, to bring these two together. So he trained the women first in that Gasthaus, and then he built the so-called Mutterhaus, the maternal house, where the maternal became bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And today this is the biggest social institution in the whole of Bavaria. They have hospitals now, not in Neuendetellsau, in Nuremberg, in Schwäbisch Hall, and everywhere. All this thanks to Löhe. Now it's another topic, not the topic of America. Yeah? All this is a repetition now, it's the same thing. People might be in Löhe's time, but of course later, in the Löhe's time, they didn't take photos. When a family was a little well-to-do, they put on their best clothes and let a photo taken of them. Another one. I think I'll show you some of the Deaconess Institute now, which I wasn't able to show the other presentation because time was up. The so-called Mutterhaus, that was built outside the village. When Löwe's friend Wilhelm Lotze came from Nuremberg, he helped him a few years. He came with the stagecoach from Nuremberg and went off in Heilsbronn, where there was a monastery. And then he walked through the forest up to Neuendetellsau, and he wrote in his book, the first thing I saw when I came out of the forest was this proud Mutterhaus. This was the greatest building in the village. Surrounded only by fields, by wheat fields. And you see the deaconesses here. Löwe said they must wear a special dress, special clothes. That's how you see them today, but not young ones today any longer. Only a few. I knew many of them in my childhood. They're all gone. They're all gone. Sometimes when you are lucky and walk through the village, I always have my camera with me, and when I see some of them, I take a photo, because there are fewer and fewer. They are all retired by now. These are the women or the girls that Löwe said, dienen will ich. I want to serve. And what if I grow old? Löwe wrote, just shrugging your shoulders, if I grow old and I grow old. My heart will be young like a palm tree, and I will walk in peace. I will walk in peace and do not care. Do not have to care about anything, because it was a community. They were not. Of course, they didn't marry. They had to be chaste to live without a husband, without a family, so they could dedicate themselves fully to that job of taking care of. I myself, I'm a witness of this in my childhood, when the fathers were at war in France, in Russia, and so on. And the women, the mothers, had to work in the fields. There was a nurse, a deaconess, Schwester Babit, my Schwester Babit, and she, when I was 3, she took care of us. We were about 12 or 15 children. So, but for Neuendetellsau, I think it would have been different. In the other villages around, nothing like this existed. Löwe, William Löwe. That is the Mutterhaus today.
Dürfen die Schwestern heutzutage heiraten?
That's a good question, because at first you can say there are none that become deaconesses. There are none. There are no young women. Young women today have other opportunities. They study, they go to university, or if they don't, they can work in an office. They can work in a shop, they can work in the supermarket, and so on. All this didn't exist in Löwe's time. There are some really who make a decision, and then I want to say, it's not that they are not allowed to marry, they don't want to marry. They just make a decision and say, no, I'll do this job. I know 2 of them. There are still some, but very, very few. And sometimes it happens, of course, that if one is still young enough and she finds a lover, then she marries and will leave this community. And it's another sort of deaconess work to care for a family. If, let's say, they marry a widower and he has a few kids, then of course that's also a good thing. The girls and women and young girls who came to America and were intended to be deaconesses, something like this, they didn't stay deaconesses for long, you know. They were married right away, because there was such a want of women here. So, as all over America, especially in the West. The Mutterhaus today, I take photos in every year and wherever I can. This is Löwe's Anstalt, the institution, the school, the church, which was a small church then, and here all those houses, the sogenannte Blödenanstalt, the institution, the homes for the handicapped ones, with parks and so on. Here, this is where the deaconesses worked. Here's, they had their own graveyard. One example, Schwester Sophie, Ruhe im Frieden. Sister Sophie, may she rest in peace, and the eternal light may be with her. She died, so and so on. Eine gütige, a good Oberschwester der Blödenanstalt. Born 30th November 1839. Died in 1904. So in 1904, this was still called the Blödenanstalt. Later, of course, by and by, this word was not used. It was taboo, as many words that have to do with such things. Then you use euphemisms in order to avoid. It's the same, the euphemism for die. I had to learn when I came to America that you don't say die. She says she passed away. These are euphemisms. You don't want to say the real thing. And that was the same with this word for those people. And nobody can be sure of not getting like that. An accident, a car accident, or some injury of the head, or a tumor in the head. I know people who had a tumor, an operation, and they woke up and they couldn't take care of themselves any longer. So you can be such a person. If you are now 20 years and healthy, or if you are 50, or if you are 80 or 82 like me, I don't know what will be the case next year or in the next 5 years. So we must always be grateful if there are people then who say, I'll do it, and not saying, none of my business. Or if it's not only just by money. Of course, today it's difficult for the institute because the young women, of course, they get their pay. There are the syndicates, and if they are not paid well enough, they strike, as at the moment at the airports and railway stations and so on. So it's a business today, and it has to be a business. If you don't make it as business, then it doesn't work. Another thing before I forget it, in 1945, no, in the first years of the 1940s, Neuendetellsau was visited by people from Berlin who came, measured, judged, selected this one, that one, and so on. And there were many were transported in gray buses, brought to state institutions, and murdered in cold blood. 1,238, exactly. Toddlers, children, adolescents, grown-ups. Of course, from my childhood, I knew some grown-ups as well who were known. When they walked through the village, you talked with them and so on. And to us as children, they appeared funny. Killed in cold blood. Euthanasia, they called it. At first, it was sterilization, and then you get in Neuendetellsau, you get the statue of the Good Shepherd in front of St. Lawrence, Jesus with a sheep on his shoulder. I could show you photos if you had time. And an inscription below, niemand wird sie aus meiner Hand reißen. Nobody will rip them out of my hands. Yeah, honest sin. And this was done by in the 1960s, a long time after all this happened, because at first, there was shame and let's try to forget it, and we wouldn't talk about that. There was a person named Fuchs. I know him as well as his wife, who passed away a few weeks before. She was almost 100. She also worked in the Heimat- und Geschichtsverein did a lot of things. And her husband discovered all this. They made an exhibition, and here it was all brought to the public. And so there was criticism for some old people in Neuendetellsau who were witnesses of what really happened. They said, no, this is not true. They were not ripped out of the hands out of the institution. There were people, officials, one person who was then the head of this, who I wouldn't say they they are to blame. We don't know how we would behave in that situation. It was a difficult time, you know, but they cooperated a little bit. Yes, it's a good thing, and the whole thing is good because it's against the Bolsheviks, the godless Bolsheviks and the communists and so on, and Hitler is doing something for Germany. We have less unemployment now, and people have work, and before there was that inflation, that terrible inflation, where a loaf of bread cost a few million marks. It's unimaginable today how people suffered from this, and they were glad when there was one who came from Austria and said, "I'll promise you, I'll change this." So they worked together, even in this field, and said, well, the state must consider somehow what to do with these people, sterilization, so that at least they can't have children, and possibly, if there are possibilities, yes, if there might be a mild form. What I want to say, we can't change the past, what happened, but we must be careful of the future, very careful, because today there are possibilities, soft ways. You do not have to kill somebody. I'll give him a pill so that he goes to sleep and so on. Euthanasia, once you start euthanasia, you open the door to hell. Yeah. Where does it stop? This is what I want to say as a message to you. Yeah.
Did you ever hear of a Lutheran pastor whose name was
Bodelschwing? Yeah.
He was in that situation. The Nazis came in and said, es wird niemand umgebracht, es sei denn über meine Leiche.
Yeah. That's another example. In Neuendetellsau, some deaconesses stood before their children and tried to prevent that they be taken into the buses, but they couldn't prevent it. There were those men in uniform and so on. And the children, some of them clung to them. Schwester, Papi, ich möchte nicht sterben, and so on. Really. And the officials, when they realized this, you see, it was too late. If you resisted, you know what happened? You know what happened to Bonhoeffer? You were in the same position to be killed. If once you try to resist, then it's too late. It was the same with another story I want to tell about the end of the war. In Brettheim, the students of the high school there, it's not a high school, it's gymnasium, which leads to the Abitur. They made a play out of this, and it's a true story. It's in the records. In Brettheim, the war was lost in the last April days of 1945. The US troops came. There were some citizens who realized this, even in Neuendetellsau, and said, white flags out of every window. That's what the Americans said. Then we won't do any harm. In Brettheim, a few Hitler boys with a Panzerfaust on their backs trying to fight the Americans, boys of 13, 14, 15 years old. And the one inhabitant of the village noticed this, saw them, went up to them, slapped one of them in the face. Schau, dass kommt, boom, der Krieg ist aus. Go home, war is over. Another boy, one of those, announced it to the SS officer in the village. The Americans were not yet there. They were just a few miles away. Announced it, and he immediately, what in German called Standgericht, a court on the spot, death by hanging. Two other citizens of the village, important, prominent citizens, neighbors of his, refused to sign death by hanging for them too. When the Americans came 2 hours or 3 hours after this, 3 men swung from the linden tree in the middle of the village. Such terrible things happened. Luckily not in Neuendetellsau. Neuendetellsau somehow, again, the grace of God, it was spared everything because all the people put out the white flags. And it might have been different because in Neuendetellsau there was a Muna, we call it the Muna, an ammunition depot with 100 bunkers. They were all hidden with concrete and earth over it. I know that as a boy. And there was an air attack on the 17th of April. I was a boy. I was sitting at the window, looking out the window. That was my television then. You know, we had no television. And so always in my grandfather's room. And then suddenly I was taken down to the basement. My mother took me, and the whole family sat down in the basement, and up it went, boom, 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 for an hour or so. And the Americans bombed the forest, hit a few of those bunkers, of course, and no bomb fell in the village, which was close to that forest. Dr. Rössler, who was for a long time the head of the Heimat- und Geschichtsverein, he told me exactly before I leave, tell the people in Frankenmuth how we admire the precision with which the American Air Force threw the bombs. I still know some of the craters. I know all of them and take photos. Of course, they are now full of weed and trees and so on. And all this did not harm Neuendetellsau. In other villages, there were different. It was different. And even Winsbach was different. 2 people were killed because the SS shot into the town from the hills above when the Americans were already there. 2 dead in Winsbach. Ansbach. Yeah, a student, Robert Limpert. You can Google him. Robert Limpert. Yeah, remember that name because it's also in these April days. Cut the cables of the Germans. 19 years old he was, or 20. Was reported, hanged on the Rathaus, on the city hall, just on the gate of the city hall, by the SS officer, the commander-in-chief in Ansbach. 2 hours before the Americans came. Horrible stories. Today he's remembered as a martyr in Ansbach, but for a long, long time they refused to remember this. So I think I could go on telling stories for 2 or 3 hours, but I don't want to keep you longer. You still have this whole Sunday before you. Any questions you might be answered, yes. Daniel, could you please? Because I've got a problem with my hearing aids. They don't work here.
The question is, does his area of Germany grow sugar beets now?
Sugar beets. Yeah, not far from Neuendetellsau, they grow sugar beets in Ochsenfurt. That is Lower Franconia. In the Main region, the Main is a river tributary to the Rhine River, the Main River, and here in Ochsenfurt is a big region where they grow sugar beets and a sugar factory. But mostly nowadays, near Winsbach and so on, mostly it was potatoes, which now also is in danger because of lack of water. We have so much drought, and everything is changing so fast. And the most, the crop that you find most frequent is maize or corn. Not for food, but for energy. They take it for making electricity. I don't know how to judge this. When I was a child, I was so happy with the cornfields and the wheat fields. Nowadays, everywhere there is this green maize or corn, which to me is not familiar. These wheat fields and cornfields, they were familiar to me. I won't complain. Well, I have no right to complain. It's just, I want to say things are like this. May I, to finish this, give you a song with a guitar? Yeah, just to finish this. Yeah. It's a song from my childhood that I had forgotten until the burial of a woman who often sang with me with 2 voices. She was so talented, she could sing second voice without practicing it. And then she died at the age of 60 or so, a teacher, a female teacher. And just a minute. I think I'll take off the glasses because these are for distance and I can see it better, the text. I don't remember the text, all of it, because as I said, I had forgotten the song until her burial when they played and sang it at her burial. And suddenly I remembered, oh, this is a song from my childhood, from the kindergarten. And it's so wonderful. It's a song meant for children, but it's also for grown-ups. It's praises Jesus as the good shepherd, and that I can feel safe as I have such a good shepherd, and I am his lamb. The words are very simple, childlike, but they touch me whenever I hear them. And you don't hear this song. It has become so rare. Possibly elderly people have heard it sometimes. Genau. Weil ich Jesus Schäflein bin, freu ich mich nur immerhin über meinen guten Hirten, der wohl weiß mich zu bewirten, der mich liebet, der mich kennt und bei seinem Namen nennt. Unter seinem sanften Stab geh ich ein und aus und hab unaussprechlich süße Weide, dass ich keinen Mangel leide. Und so oft ich durstig bin, führt er mich zum Brunnenquell hin. Sollt ich denn nicht fröhlich sein, ich beglücktes Schäfelein, denn nach diesen schönen Tagen werd ich endlich heimgetragen in des Hirten Arm und Schoß. Amen, ja, mein Glück ist groß. Thank you very much. Thanks. Thank you very much. Hast du das Lied? Dankeschön.
We have a present for you.